The Monroe Doctrine looks like it's still alive and well, as the US military deployed a fleet of warships and marines surrounding the coast of Venezuela. The Pentagon's official messaging is that it's a mission to combat the drug cartels, but Venezuela's President Maduro says it's actually just a pretense for the US to pull off a regime change against him. We'll see how this is actually just the most recent spat in a decades-long string of escalations between these two nations. These two have gone from being best bros to being on this collision course in a relatively short period of time. The buildup of American firepower in the Caribbean is the largest in over a generation, with at least a nuclear attack submarine, 3 guided missile destroyers, and multiple landing ships carrying over 4,500 sailors and marines. And if you've ever seen how boring it gets out at sea on a MEU, these guys are begging the cartel to do something. And do something they did, because the strike group fired their first shots at the Venezuelan cartel, blowing up a smuggling boat, killing 11 alleged Tren de Aragua cartel members in a gigantic fireball. Instead of capturing and questioning these guys like they would have with the Coast Guard's help normally in the past, the military is now shooting first and asking questions never. Venezuela's armed forces responded by deploying their own warships armed with Chinese anti-ship missiles and long-range Iranian-designed drones off the coast. Maduro scrambled 2 of his F-16 fighter jets that he'd ordered to buzz American destroyers at low altitude. How did he get those? What's really happening here is Venezuela and the US are acting out a much older geopolitical drama that has its roots in the Monroe Doctrine over 200 years ago. And the story of how these two nations went from being best friends to worst adversaries helps explain what we're going to see next. Is this a ramp up to a US invasion, an attempt at regime change, or saber rattling? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out. Today's episode is sponsored by Ground News. We'll use their website to analyze this story about if the United States will strike Mexican cartels on their territory. It gives me the fast facts right up on top from over 400 different outlets. Ground News goes ahead and tells me which of the 10% of the sources are state-funded, which means they're getting paid by the government, which is something I need to know if they're possibly a straight-up mouthpiece of a nation. And these are just some patterns that you start to notice when you play around with the app as a tool. Some US outlets frame the story as routine clarification. Outlets in Mexico, however, warn that it shows growing mistrust between allies. Ground News lays all this out on their bias map, so I can see how each side is spinning the story. That's why Ground News has become my go-to tool for cutting through disinformation and misinformation. And because I believe in it so much, they're offering you guys 40% off this same Vantage plan that I use. Just click the link in the description or go to ground.news/Cappy or scan the QR code. It brings the price down to just $5 a month. If you want a better understanding of the world, give Ground News a shot. To understand why these US warships are parked off Venezuela's coast, we have to start with its geopolitical importance. So Venezuela sits at one of the most strategic pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere, right near the vital shipping lanes to the Panama Canal. And beneath it all, they have the world's largest proven oil reserves, although it's heavy oil that's harder to refine. Venezuela is only about 1,000 miles away from Florida. Its close proximity and socialist ways are why it's being called the new Cuba of the Second Cold War. And as with all sequels, it's much bigger, with a population of 30 million people and a gigantic 350,000 square miles of territory. Its topography is made of dense jungles and mountains, which would make an invasion a real pain.
Venezuela, that was some mean bush.
They have over 500,000 combined active duty and reservists, a modern arsenal of Russian main battle tanks, fighter jets, and Iranian kamikaze drones within striking distance of America. But the irony is that not so long ago, the same geography made Venezuela America's strongest ally in all of Latin America. So what went so very wrong? The dictator Juan Gomez seizes power in 1908 and decides to open the doors wide up to US oil companies. America has the industrial know-how to develop his nation's untapped oil fields. Within just a generation, the US-Venezuela partnership transforms the nation into the largest petroleum exporter in Latin America. It's a win-win. With their 50-50 split of profits, that makes the country flush with guap. They've got cold hard cash, and it's just in time for World War II. Venezuela fuels the Allied war machine. They provide 50% of all US oil imports, becoming their single largest oil supplier. This is a huge strategic win for America because it only takes 3 days to ship oil from Venezuela compared to the 30 days that it takes to get oil in from the Middle East. The US sends dozens of Sherman tanks and fighter aircraft as a sign of affection, but the military bromance between the two nations is just beginning to blossom because in 1947, the two countries join what's called the Rio Pact. It commits them to helping each other defend the Western Hemisphere against any outside attack like, communism. The Rio Pact is a lot like NATO, but for the Americas instead of Europe. It even has an Article 3 clause that states an attack on one is attack on all. At its height, everybody who's anybody in the Western Hemisphere is part of the Rio Pact. It's now the 1950s and Venezuela tosses aside its form of dictatorship and authoritarian rule. They become a stable democracy with elections and all that good stuff. This puts them in even closer alignment with the United States government. In fact, Venezuela's friendship allows it to avoid all those brutal coups and military interventions that the US conducts throughout Latin America in the Cold War. And this is only the beginning. These two nations' relations are on fire in the best way. Because in 1973, the Arab oil countries withhold oil from the United States. Venezuela steps in and helps out to reliably supply oil to America throughout that embargo. And things could not possibly get any better. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Then in 1976, things start to shift. Venezuela nationalizes the oil industry, which ends direct US corporate control of its oil fields. So overnight, Exxon's forced to hand over control to the new Venezuelan state-owned oil company. Now the relationship has started to shift because the United States is simply buying the oil from Venezuela instead of owning it, which means future Venezuelan leaders could use oil as a political weapon against Washington. But that was a problem to worry about in the future. All relations have their ups and downs, and for now, relations are reaching an all-time high. It's the 1980s, and Venezuela just signed the Peace Delta program. It allows them to receive 24 of the advanced American F-16 fighter jets, so that's where they got them. They're actually the only Latin American country to be granted this powerful capability directly. American armored vehicles, European fighter jets, and a whole fleet of modern naval frigates start flowing in. Venezuela was looking like a full-on petro-state democracy. But underneath the boom, the resource curse is about to show its ugly head. The resource curse is the fact that Venezuela is 95% dependent on oil for revenue. This is a major risk. It's a huge liability because in the mid-1980s, the price of oil collapses from $30 a barrel to under $10 a barrel. This wipes out government revenue overnight, and Venezuela's turned to the Western-led institution, the IMF, for help. The IMF is sort of like a payday loan company, but for countries. The $4.5 billion bailout comes with strict strings attached. This money comes with austerity measures, which means they have to cut back drastically on government spending. So if you're a citizen living in Venezuela, all you see is overnight the cost to fill up your gas tank rises by 100%. Many people lose their jobs, and social programs that people rely on are eliminated. This shock triggers days of riots by the people. The government in response deploys the army domestically to restore order. It's a horrible, chaotic scene. The Venezuelan soldiers open fire on crowds of people, and for 3 days, the capital of Caracas looks like a war zone. The brutal crackdown is called the Caracaso Massacre. It's seared into the public consciousness in Venezuela to this day. The effects were devastating. It was similar to like the Great Depression. Among the young officers, though, ordered to deploy during this crackdown against their own people was a paratrooper named Hugo Chavez. He later says he never forgot what he saw, the government turning their rifles on their own citizens. 3 years later, he tries to overthrow the government with a coup. It fails, he's sent to prison, Chavez is later pardoned, and in 1998, he wins the presidency on a promise that he's going to return the nation's oil wealth to the people. Chavez institutes a form of socialism under his slogan of motherland, socialism, or death. Right during this time, a drug trafficking organization called Cartel of the Suns takes form as a network inside Venezuela's military and political elite, starting as low-ranking officers skimming profits off drug shipments that are passing into the United States. But this is where the U.S. relations with Venezuela take a serious serious turn for the worse. Chavez was openly hostile to the United States from the get-go because from his perspective, Washington had spent decades exploiting Venezuela's oil and toppling left-leaning governments across Latin America. Hugo Chavez says, quote, "The government brought soldiers from the interior like an invading army, as if they were the armed forces of the IMF, but the two nations are still forced to play nice with one another. The US government is still reliant on Venezuela for about a sixth of their oil imports, and Chavez continues selling oil to the United States because he needs that income." But on April 11, 2002, opposition groups stage a massive march in Caracas. Violence erupts, gunfire breaks out, dozens of people are killed with hundreds injured, and top military commanders who had been planning for this for months seize on the chaos, demanding Chavez's resignation. Chavez is arrested by the military, and moments later, the US government, under the Bush administration, quickly recognizes his replacement. But within 48 hours, Chavez is returned to power by loyalists and a public outcry supporting him. The Bush administration claims they had no credible information on the coup plot. However, years later, it's revealed the CIA had actually known weeks in advance. This CIA document here was later declassified, showing intel that they gathered that a coup was about to happen. Whether the CIA was directly involved or just turned a blind eye, either way, Chavez blames the United States for the coup against him. In 2005, the US imposes a full arms embargo on Venezuela, making it impossible for Chavez to get the vital replacement parts that he needs to run his F-16 fighter jets. He turns to buying military equipment from Russia, including T-72 tanks, Su fighter jets, AK-103 rifles, and since 2008, Moscow has flown Tu-160 nuclear-capable long-range strategic bombers into Venezuela, staging them at their military air bases. And Russian warships have docked in Venezuelan ports, and advisors from Russia have trained Venezuelan forces on S-300 air defense systems that they have. Russian soldiers with Wagner patches have been seen on social media helping stop protests there. China builds radar stations monitoring US fighter aircrafts and naval traffic. Well, that all escalated quickly. Venezuela has become the most hostile nation towards the United States in Latin America, but it hasn't fully crossed the line yet between these two. It can still be turned around and salvaged. No one said anything yet that they couldn't take back. Fellas, I can still save her. A month later, Chavez starts using the profits from American-bought oil to subsidize Cuba, Nicaragua, and 12 other nations. The petrocarbide program turns oil into diplomacy. It buys him allies, which in turn buys him votes at the UN. These votes are then used as a block against US projects. US agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy start to fight back. They send millions of dollars in funding to Venezuelan opposition groups and media outlets in an attempt to weaken Chavez's power or outright overthrow him. Chavez makes a move that won't allow that to happen. He abolishes presidential term limits in 2009. The country officially slides back into authoritarian rule. Relations between these two are now worse than estranged. We're in the middle of a full-blown messy divorce. Son, it's not your fault. Your mother just wants to see other communists. And when Chavez dies in 2013, Nicolás Maduro inherits the state and the hate for America. But it's the worst possible time for Maduro because the shale oil boom inside the United States makes importing oil from Venezuela no longer necessary. The United States becomes a net exporter of oil within a matter of a few short years, and Maduro loses almost all his leverage over the United States almost immediately. Between 2014 and 2016, oil drops from $100 a barrel to $30. This means nearly all of the Venezuelan government's income vanishes. Hyperinflation sets in, and the economy is in freefall. Maduro claims victory in the 2018 election, but international observers and much of the Venezuelan public reject it as fraudulent. The problem is, Maduro doesn't have the je ne sais quoi of Chavez. He doesn't have the popular support and love that Chavez did. And to make up for this, Maduro jails major opposition candidates. They escape into exile as well. And in 2019, Washington indicts Maduro in US courts as a narco drug trafficker and places a $10 million bounty on his head for his arrest. In response, Maduro leans even harder on America's enemies for support. He sells cheap oil to China, invites Iranian Quds Force operatives, which is like their version of the CIA, to establish the largest military drone production facility in all of Latin America on Venezuelan soil, pumping out armed Shahed-style attack drones, the same type that Russia's using against Ukraine. We are on a full-blown collision course now. Gentlemen, with the claims of widely believed fraudulent election in 2020, the US takes even more drastic steps. President Trump institutes sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off what little oil purchases remain, and the economy there goes from bad to worse. The foreign policy goal switches to trying to force regime change by preventing Maduro from being capable of paying his forces. With millions of dollars in bounty money on the table, a group of mercenaries with 2 former US Special Forces operators attempt to land on Venezuelan beaches to capture Maduro and overthrow his government. The plan to exploit what they believe will be thousands of soldiers who will join up against them doesn't pan out. The plan fails almost immediately. Several are killed, and Americans are captured and imprisoned.
Venezuelan authorities killed 8 of the men whom they described as mercenary terrorists.
With smuggling of drugs, gold, and selling cheap oil to China, it means that Maduro has enough to pay his forces for their loyalty, and this rekindles talk of the Monroe Doctrine, a 200-year-old principle that warns rival powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It's originally supposed to be an agreement for the US and Europe to not mess in each other's backyards, but over time it morphs into something much bigger. It becomes a foundational pillar of US dominance in the hemisphere. The strategy believes the US cannot become a great power of the world if it's concerned about adversaries at home, so Washington uses the Monroe Doctrine to justify various bloody interventions like in Panama, coups and occupations across the hemisphere, but in Moscow and Beijing, they claim that the doctrine is really about pushing American imperialism. They claim it's hypocritical because at the same time, the United States stations troops on Russia's border and sails warships through China's coastal waters. America's response to that is they claim it's about defending sovereignty of smaller nations. As Venezuela's economy entirely collapses, 7 million Venezuelan citizens flee the country, many of them to the United States and neighboring countries, causing an immigration crisis across the Americas. Gangs like Tren de Aragua start showing up in US cities, driving discussions about border security and immigration debates. What was once foreign policy has quickly become domestic politics inside the United States. And that's when in 2023, Maduro sees a possible way out of his predicament. He sees a way to claw back all his oil wealth and his position of power domestically. He claims the disputed region from his tiny neighbor Guyana. The recently discovered oil reserves found there can make the much smaller nation of Guyana the world's fastest growing oil producer. Maduro uses this threat of military action as a domestic rallying point. He claims it's to defend sacred Venezuelan territory. He uses this as new leverage to pressure American oil companies that want a piece of that crude oil. Maduro uses the possible invasion as justification to buy more military equipment from the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese. Venezuela deploys troops right to the border of Guyana and begins building new military infrastructure to create a credible threat of an invasion force. Guyana has only 4,000 troops, so they call for backup. The United Kingdom sends a warship to support them, and the US under the Biden administration begins holding joint military drills in solidarity and doing flyovers with fighter jets. They state that they're supporting Guyana's sovereignty, and they increase the reward for Maduro's arrest to $15 million. Now that brings us to today and the most recent escalation. The US government is once again applying maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela by first increasing that bounty to $50 million for Maduro's capture, and now with sanctions so far failing to create changes in the politics in Venezuela, the US government is turning to an old strategy also from the 19th century like the Monroe Doctrine, gunboat diplomacy. They're attempting to use a naval force to pressure Maduro into compliance without outright declaring war. And that's why when you see 7 US warships off Venezuela's coast today, it isn't just about drug cartels likely, it fits a long pattern of power projection. Today, US naval deployments surrounding Venezuela are too large to simply be to counter drug trafficking. You don't need guided missile destroyers and amphibious landing vehicles to do that. But the strike force is also too small for a full-blown invasion, which would require an aircraft carrier and many times more troops. Instead, the fleet of warships is exactly the right size to project power and put pressure on Maduro by forcing him to pay money, millions of dollars, to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people and equipment and troops, funds that, as we just learned, his nation does not have. It puts his forces into an alert status and forces him to react. He then went on to claim to have mobilized 4.5 million armed citizens and is threatening to call up a full republic in arms, which would be a tremendous sap on his resources. If this pressure were to be sustained, it could lead to a coup against him, or at the least a thorn in his side. This wouldn't be the first time this has been done. In 1964, the US executed Operation Brother Sam by sending an aircraft carrier and destroyers to Brazil in coordination with a coup against their president, who was unfriendly to the United States. The Brazilian president fled, and the generals friendly to the US seized power. US officials weren't going to allow another Cuba to take root in South America then, and they likely aren't going to allow it today. In gunboat diplomacy, it isn't always about regime change. It can be for compliance, to negotiate a deal that involves oil sales to the United States instead of to China, or the removal of Russian and Iranian military infrastructure inside Venezuela. It's likely an attempt to get Latin American governments to take a stronger stance against drug cartels, which Maduro is already claiming to do with the deployment of 15,000 troops to the border with Colombia. Whatever the end goal is, the deployment follows a clear historical trend in the Americas. When the US is unable to overthrow a government, like in Cuba, they instead turn to isolating that government economically until they're no longer perceived as a strategic threat. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Show notes, sources, and exclusive content is available on CappyArmy.com, where you can also get our newest merch, the GI Fuel t-shirt. Thank you for watching. Ending transmission now.